Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Edwina Hughes and I'm head of Cool Food, the World Resources Institute's Sustainable Diets platform, and I'm your host today. First of all, some housekeeping. This session is being recorded and we're really happy to have some members of the media in the audience today. The recording will be available for viewing later on WRI's website. We'd also love to get questions from you, so please do post your questions for speakers in the Q&A and we'll get to as many of them as possible. But on to today's content. The content of today's session builds on a set of ideas that feature in our most recent food blog, which is available on the WRI website now. Today, we discuss what WRI sees as significant opportunities as we and others around the world prepare for the UN's first ever Food Systems Summit. The summit presents an unparalleled opportunity to transform how the world produces, distributes, and consumes food in ways that are better for the people and for planet. The food system's impact is further than just our plates though, and changes will impact climate security, livelihoods, political stability, development, and much more. Today, we are taking a deep dive into what this moment means for the global food system, what success looks like, and some of the game-changing ideas that our 5 experts are excited about to help the world achieve a sustainable and equitable food future. So as you can see, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers today from across the Institute. And I'm now very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Ed Davey. Ed is International Engagement Director for the Food and Land Use Coalition and co-director at WRI UK. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you so much, Edwina, and thank you very much to everyone for joining today's session. It's been an extraordinary privilege for WRI and for the Food and Land Use Coalition to be involved in the UN Food Systems Summit and to do our best to support this unique process over the past year. And in the next few minutes, I just want to try to set the scene across WRI's work and FOLU's work about what we see to be critically important to next week's pre-summit and also to the UN summit itself in September in New York. I'm going to talk about 8 letters, 2 P's, 2 R's, 3 I's, and 1 A. And if you'll allow me, I'll try and present those 8 letters in around 6 minutes. The first letter, the letter P, is produce. The world needs to sustainably boost yields on existing agricultural lands in order to meet projected growth in demand for food without expanding agriculture's land footprint. We articulate the PPRR, by the way, in our World Resources Institute Creating a Sustainable Food Future report that forms the bedrock of our view on the Food Systems Summit. The second P, the world needs to protect the remaining native natural ecosystems, forests, wetlands, grasslands that the world still has. Protect those from agricultural related conversion and degradation. Agriculture is one of the principal drivers of the loss of those ecosystems, and yet they store the majority of terrestrial carbon and they provide the critical ecosystem services that underpin food production, such as water regulation, pollination, and climate regulation. The 2 R's are also critically important. The first, reduce. The world needs to bend the curve in demand growth for land-intensive products by reducing existing inefficiencies in the food system. And that includes halving the rate of food loss and waste by 2030, shifting to more sustainable and healthy diets, and reducing competition for land and food from other sectors such as biofuel production. The second R is restore. At the same time, the world's food system needs to restore what's been lost, revitalizing nature in some places and restoring productivity to degraded agriculture in other places. And across these first 4 letters, friends, PPRR, we're talking about the land, but we're also critically talking about the ocean, as we'll discuss today. Together, this produce, protect, reduce, restore approach could nutritiously feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050, but also help poor farmers out of poverty. At the same time, it would put food and land use systems on a path to compliance with the mitigation goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And in the WRR, next slide please, we articulate a menu of solutions to reduce the food system's greenhouse gas emissions by between 70 and 100% by 2050. And that chart articulates the PPRR approach that I've just described. At the same time, next slide please, we've also got to pursue, next slide again, the 3 I's that I referenced at the beginning: innovation, investment, and inclusion. And in another signature report of the WRI, in partnership with 8 other global organizations in the Food and Land Use Coalition, we articulated in Growing Better, our signature report in 2019, how to pursue this agenda of innovation, investment, and inclusion. And in that report, we argued that in terms of innovation, there are some incredible technologies that need to be pursued at scale to shift the food system in this direction. And WRI has also done work on that, and it's also referenced in the WRR. FOLU also went on to argue that the world needs in the order of $300 billion to $350 billion per year for a period of 10 years to shift the global food system in this direction. But the economics of doing that are really advantageous. Globally, this year alone, the global food system may generate $10 trillion in value, but it actually generates $12 trillion in terms of externalities, negative costs to the global economy. And so that 10 trillion of value discounted against the 12 trillion of loss actually means that together, at present in the world, the food system is generating economic losses at scale. That investment figure of $300 to $350 billion per year could shift the food system in the direction of major economic opportunity and contribution. But this also needs to be an inclusive agenda. Fishers need to be at the heart of it, indigenous peoples, communities on the front line, farm laborers, laborers across the food system, companies, governments. This is an agenda that encompasses everybody, citizens. And so we also believe that inclusion, the 3rd I, is at the heart of the summit. But also critically, and we'll speak to this in the course of today, the food system is under real threat from climate change, and it needs to adapt to the changing climate. And Rebecca will talk to this in more depth. Next slide, please. But it's absolutely clear to us, and it's at the heart of the Food System Summit, that farmers, fishers, herders, and others are particularly vulnerable to the climate changing and to the shocks and stresses that that brings. And WRI has done a lot of work in this area and wants to see major progress on this agenda at next week's pre-summit. So in conclusion, Edwina, I'll pass back to you. We have worked very hard in support of the UN Food System Summit. We really believe it's a seminal moment, and we believe it's a moment in which the world can come together to work on this shared agenda, 8-part agenda: reduce, protect, reduce, restore, innovate, invest, include people, and adapt. Back to you, Edwina.
Brilliant, thanks Ed, and thank you very much for setting the scene for us. I think you've done a great job of just laying out the landscape of the solutions that we back. So what I'd like to do now is to hand over to Liz Goodwin, who is Senior Fellow and Director for Food Loss and Waste at WRI. She's also the co-lead of the Food Loss and Waste Action Area for the Food System Summit. And Liz is going to speak about the challenge, but also the opportunity that food loss and waste presents us as we seek to build a sustainable food future. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Edwina. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk about this subject that we've been working collectively on for so long. And as Ed says, this year provides a pivotal opportunity for us to actually get the whole food system discussed more broadly and raise things up the agenda. And as Ed also said, I focus on the issue of food loss and waste, and that's the area I've been focusing on as part of the Food System Summit. And as Ed says, we're not going to be able to achieve the Paris Agreement targets, and we're not actually going to get to net zero type emissions unless we tackle the issue of food loss and waste. It accounts for 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as costing the global economy around $1 trillion every year. So I've been co-leading this piece of work within the Food Systems Summit on food loss and waste, putting together views and ideas and suggestions from lots of people from around the world who've been working on this subject for many years. And I think it's fair to say that in a way, we're quite fortunate compared to some of the other areas of the Food Systems Summit in that we have actually been working on food loss and waste for a number of years. And so we know what some of the problems are and we know what some of the solutions are. And really about the game changer is about how do you actually make those become more mainstream. So we've pulled together a cluster of initiatives under the heading of food loss and waste. And they're basically around following the overall strategy of Target Measure Act. So you set the target to reduce your food loss and waste. You then measure, you do some sort of assessment, and you try to understand where your issues are, where in the supply chain they are. Are they mainly at the household end, or are they at farms, or are they somewhere? They're probably spread around across the whole supply chain, but where are your hotspots? And then you can make decisions about what actions are needed to address those hotspots. So the cluster of initiatives, the first one is around this whole assessment piece, fundamental to getting started. The second one is around farm losses. We know what's needed, but how do you build that momentum, and how do you actually help build both the infrastructure but also the capability to be able to address the farm loss. Supply chain, really important, and somewhere where we've seen a lot of progress in recent years, where you get big organizations, big retailers working with their supply chains, so going all the way down the supply chain back to farm level to work as a supply chain to halve food loss and waste. And it's only by getting that collaboration up and down the supply chain that you see real benefits. There's a piece on consumers. How do you address this whole issue of household food waste? It happens in every single country. The recent UNEP report clearly showed that it is not just a developed world issue. It's a problem both in low and middle income countries as well. So how do you tackle that consumer food waste piece and actually reduce household food waste? And then the role of governments and other organizations in helping to make the food system more circular. How do you prevent things falling out of the system, losses falling out of the system, food becoming waste? We want to get to the point where food never ends up in a landfill, and ideally it doesn't end up in an incinerator either. So how do you make the system more circular? Can you do more upcycling of food? Can you make sure that you get as much food waste reduction happening as possible? Where food might be going to become waste, then find ways of donating it or using it for animal feed. Could it be then converted into fertilizer? Just finding lots of ways to ensure that food never ends up going into the bin. And then finally, there's a finance piece, and that's important because for a lot of countries, this is quite overawing about the issue of finance, and we need to help them to de-risk the investment required. For a lot of these solutions actually do have a very strong business case for taking action, especially the supply chain stuff. But it is still quite scary for some countries. You know, that initial assessment piece costs money. So how do you help that piece of work to go on and take place so that solutions can be found? So that's the overall cluster. And we're now in the process of trying to build a coalition of member states and others who are going to take this forward post the summit in September. And what we're hoping to do at the pre-summit next week is to actually start to get some of those member states saying, we're going to work together to build this coalition. And so, in fact, just before this webinar, I was on a call with member states trying to understand where they are. And you know, a lot of them are very supportive, very keen, but it's getting them to actually prioritize and put this at the top of their list and not second or third, because member states have got lots of things to grapple with. And I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to take any questions later.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. You know, I think it's really interesting the way you describe how countries might think about tackling food loss and waste, and this idea of hotspots, because as you say yourself, the waste happens at different stages in different kinds of economies. And so, it's really interesting just to think about that. I also enjoy just hearing you talking about, what government might need to do to step up, and also consumers. So it does feel like this is an issue that needs a lot of different agents to take action. So I'd now like to introduce Christian Telecki, who is Global Director for the Ocean at WRI. And Christian is going to tell us about the opportunities that blue food present at this critical time. Christian.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Edwina, and delighted to be here with you all today. May I have the next slide, please? I mean, what I wanted to talk about, and Ed briefly jumped onto this, was the ocean, the notion of also not talking about food systems in terms of land, but also in terms of ocean systems as well. And so, and for some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not, but I want to start off with just a little bit about, why they matter. And how they connect them to the other SDGs that you see on the screen at the moment. And when you think about aquatic or blue foods, as we've been calling them, they really play a central role in helping to end malnutrition and building nature positive and resilient food systems. And some of the statistics are incredible in terms of the relevance that they have for day-to-day lives. 800 million people rely on small-scale fisheries and aquaculture for their livelihoods. And this helps reduce poverty at the local level. So many people involved with aquatic systems. Fish account for 50 to 90% of animal protein in the diets of small island states, and this is up to 3 to 4 times higher than the global average. So really important for in terms of a daily diet. Almost 50% of those working within the seafood supply chains within fishing are women. But remarkably and disappointingly, they are not working under the same conditions or pay scales as men in that. So, thinking about that in terms of the context of what it means for as far as the social dimensions, 90% of the fish workers and fishers in developing economies account for half of the global catch of blue foods, and really boosting global food security. A healthy ocean and other aquatic sources are essential to keep our climate in balance, feed a growing population, and support economic development and protect habitats and wildlife. But of course, with the good news, I'm afraid there is some bad news. This will be very familiar to many of you on the line, but over a third of the world's fish stocks are overfished, and 845 million people will become deficient in essential micronutrients if overfishing continues, a practice that we must and need to end. Disappointing as well, this may come as a surprise to you, that an estimated 35% of the global harvest is wasted every year in fisheries and aquaculture. This is a remarkable figure, and protein that could be put to good use, but is lost, and something we need to spend some time on and focus on. Climate change is predicted to reduce the productivity of fisheries in tropical countries by up to 40%. A major impact for many of those that are relying on their day-to-day sources of protein from aquatic sources. And finally, and by no means least, instead of managing aquatic foods as simply natural resources, we need to manage them as a critical component of strategies to deliver healthy, sustainable, and equitable food systems, a point that I'm going to come to shortly. But you can see, I hope, that if we address some of these issues in the ocean when it comes to blue food, we can start ticking a lot of the other boxes in terms of the other targets under the SDGs. May I have the next slide, please? So I mentioned briefly that blue foods are part of a nature positive and resilient, food systems. And we know that something needs to change if we are to nutritiously and equitably feed people amid worsening climate change impacts without destroying people's livelihoods and the planet in the process. So if done in the right way, blue foods can be produced with a lower environmental footprint than many terrestrial foods. Less energy, less water, more productivity in terms of return on investment. And there is a potential to increase production if sustainable practices are ensured. So really the production side, extremely important. But we cannot produce healthy aquatic food without healthy aquatic ecosystems. So we need to ensure that fishing and aquaculture practices allow for protection and restoration of the ocean and inland waters, whether that's through sustainable fisheries management, restorative aquaculture practices, or indeed regenerative ocean farming. And then finally, and by no means least, when it comes to blue food, we have a responsibility to use every part of what we are catching and growing. It is not acceptable that 35% of that is being lost in some way or wasted when so many people around the world are growing hungry on a day-to-day basis and missing that incredibly important micronutrients of the protein that is there. And this means reducing seafood loss and waste through policy changes, innovations, and incentives. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say anything about the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy, which the WRI has leads the secretary on. They launched 14 heads of state launched a series of transformations or outcomes that they'd like to see happen by 2030, and a number of priority actions that they've committed to within that. One of those was a big dimension on food from the ocean. And part of their mantra that is using is think about the 3 Ps of protect, produce, and prosper. So we know that if we effectively protect the ocean, we can sustainably produce from it. And very importantly, we can equitably prosper from the ocean in the same rate. And finally, I think we're at an incredible intersection in terms of the terrific innovations that are out there that will help us not find the global solution, but many local solutions that are locally relevant and applicable to address some of these issues. And I direct you to a particular one that we've been involved with Uplink Ocean and the Blue Food Challenge that was recently launched there that really tries to give surface to some of those solutions at the local level. And finally, if I may, just if I could go to the next slide, when we talk about solutions, indeed, there are many, and we know that we have to achieve nature positive and resilient aquatic food systems and through these solutions. And a number of organizations, including the Environmental Defense Fund, World Fish, Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, and Friends of Ocean Action, are supporting member states to come together under the auspices of the UN Food System Summit to align on delivering these solutions. Very important that member states are delivering and carrying through the conversation, and the action, not just at the summit itself, but beyond. And this is a thread that will continue to 2030 and beyond. You can see key solutions being focused on this group. By this group, I'm not going to read this list, but I'd like to highlight 2 or 3 that I think are critical and particularly exciting and important. So one is, despite the critical role of aquatic and blue foods are really missing from conversations on transforming food systems. And for one reason or not, that is the case, but we need to work on bringing aquatic foods into the heart of food system decision-making by integrating them into a holistic food policy making, really treating it as a complete food system, linking the land to ocean, ocean to land, and making sure we take a holistic approach to that. Secondly, we need to protect and develop the potential of blue foods to help end malnutrition, recognizing and harnessing the nutritional diversity of aquatic foods while protecting aquatic ecosystems. This means including aquatic foods and, for example, national food-based dietary guidelines, school feeding programs, and social safety net programs. Just this morning, I was on the phone with the president of Kenya's office, and one of the areas two of the areas that the president is prioritizing, and I'm just looking at my notes here, are improving food security and nutrition, because he views this as a way to ensure that 70% of the population, which represent the younger generation and the youth, can have healthier lifestyles and healthier diets that allow them to enter into the workforce and contribute to a growing and sustainable ocean economy and broader economy of Kenya. So a critical component there in terms of nutrition. And then finally, and by no means least, given that small-scale actors supply most of aquatic foods for direct human consumption, efforts to support the central role of small-scale actors in fisheries and aquaculture are vital. So governments need to ensure that small-scale actors, including women, indigenous people, and other marginalized groups, are included in aquatic food decision-making. So finally, is just let's make sure that the UN Food System Summit, that the aquatic foods, blue foods, is really central and part of the conversation, not the margins, and that we carry this conversation forward and the action continues, not just at the summit, but the decades beyond. Back to you, Edwina.
Thanks, Christian. That was just really fascinating. And I'm just amazed by that 35% statistic around the food that's wasted from the sea. It just seems incredible. But I think what it does for me is it really reflects the fact that the diagram that Ed showed earlier, you know, the World Resources Report, that waterfall diagram actually, that there are a number of things we need to do, but that they're very interlinked actually. So we've got food loss and waste, and then we've got sustainable seafood, and we've got a range of other things. And so what we're seeing is this interconnection between all of the issues. And I think, Christian, maybe just the other thing that really struck me is just that this is an event, but this is more than an event. It's actually about what happens after the event and how the conversations continue. And I thought that was a very interesting point to make. So now we're going to move on to hear from Rebecca Carter, who is Acting Director, Climate Resilience Practice. And it's quite a timely presentation in the flow of things, because Rebecca is going to talk about some of the investment that's necessary for us to ensure that the world's 500 million small-scale food producers are not left behind. Rebecca.
Great. Thanks so much, Edwina, for that kind introduction, and happy to be here with my colleagues and all of you who have taken the time to join us today. Next slide, please. So as Ed mentioned, transforming the global food system will take everyone, and it's at all scales, from consumption to production and everywhere in between. But I'd like to focus my remarks today on adaptation and resilience, on the importance of small-scale food producers in the global food system. As Edwina mentioned, there are about 500 million small-scale farmers, herders, and fishers, and these are the people who live and work on the front lines of climate change impacts, and yet have the fewest resources with which to adapt. As this graphic depicts, many of them lack the resources needed to adapt to climate change impacts, especially those in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. These small-scale food producers face a widening inequity gap with larger producers who have more resources. That is, they have more access to land, capital, credit, information, and other resources with which to adapt. These small-scale producers are the ones who are at the greatest risk of being left behind as climate change impacts intensify. Now, within this group of lower endowment or resource-poor small producers, it's often marginalized groups such as women, youth, and indigenous producers who are at the greatest risk of deepening poverty, and it's their rights and access to resources that must be prioritized by the World Food System Summit. Another change that we need to see is shifts in how finance for adaptation and other types of agricultural development flows. It needs to move from being largely a top-down exercise that's conducted sort of from the national capital to more of a locally led model in which power over decision-making is devolved to local communities and local actors, along with a greater share of the finances with which to implement these needed changes. Next slide, please. So how exactly do we build the resilience and improve the incomes and livelihoods of these vulnerable small-scale food producers? Well, the key is helping them to better manage increasing climate change risk through measures that include diversifying their incomes so that they have more than one income source to draw from during especially difficult years, of which we're unfortunately going to see more as climate change continues, as well as strengthening social support systems to get them through those challenging times without losing their critical productive assets so that they can bounce back faster. It also means increasing their productivity, of course, and improving their access to some of the resources I've already mentioned, but also new types of support, or types of support that may be new to different areas around the world, like access to insurance, finance, markets, different types of technologies, and agroecological practices where they are appropriate. I'd also like to note that, as we detail in a new report that you can find on our website, as climate change impacts intensify, there will be a growing number of places where farmers and herders will need to produce entirely new types of crops and livestock better suited to changing climates, or in some cases, even transition out of agriculture entirely. We're talking about situations where sea level rise might salinate aquifers so that farmers are no longer able to irrigate their crops, or places where temperature sensitive crops like coffee will simply no longer grow, and farmers are going to need new options entirely. This is going to require dedicated support and new types of financing and new types of mechanisms to get the assistance to the farmers who are going to need it so that they're not left behind. Next slide, please. Now, I'd like to close by going over a few more specific ways we could support small-scale food producers as climate change impacts intensify to prevent the inequality gap from widening any further. The first is that more funding will be needed for agricultural research around the world, including through the CGIAR system as it embeds climate change in its new 10-year strategy. But we must also ensure that this expanded research is demand-led. In other words, that small-scale producers have decision-making power in what types of crops and livestock are put on the research agenda, how they're implemented, and to make sure that the benefits really reach those who have the greatest need. We'll also need to expand access to climate-informed digital advisory services by enhancing information in them on issues like weather and seasonal forecasts, pest and disease early warnings, digital soil maps, and adaptive adaptation practices. So just to wrap up, thanks very much for the opportunity to share these thoughts and recommendations on ways to build the resilience of small-scale producers while enhancing their incomes and livelihoods. And now it's up to the World System Summit to see how we can deliver on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I think one of the things that really resonates with me as a farmer's daughter is the idea that the research needs to be informed by the needs of the farmers so that the insights can then help them directly. So we're now going to move on to our final speaker, Cristina Rumbide Del Rio, International Engagement Associate, the Food and Land Use Coalition, Senior Adaptation and Resilience Advisor for the Climate Resilience Practice at WRI. And Cristina is going to touch on her own game-changing ideas. Cristina.
Thanks, Edwina. Pleasure to be here with you today and with colleagues. I'm speaking on behalf of the Food and Land Use Coalition, or FOLU as we call it. And for those of you that don't know FOLU, let me take a second to introduce ourselves. FOLU is a community of organizations and individuals committed to transforming the way we produce and consume food, the way we use our land for people, nature, and climate. It's hosted by WRI and brings together work of multiple organizations. Next slide. And I'm going to start off talking about some of the game changers that we're championing as part of the FOLU coalition, starting with talking about hunger. So after declining originally over the past couple decades and then remaining about a bit steady for the past 5 years, the number of undernourished people rose to 768 million last year, or equivalent to about 10% of the world's population. This represents a one-year increase of 118 to 161 million at the high end in terms of the number of hungry people in 1 year alone in the past year. And this is particularly troubling if you think about the number of small children that are in that population. Whose development is fundamentally disrupted by that malnourishment and hunger. It's important to realize that this isn't just a production issue, it's a distribution and equity issue. It's an issue of predicting and responding to climate shocks or conflicts or pandemic-related shocks, as Rebecca touched on, and having the safety nets, the social safety nets in place where we can't predict or prevent harm. The good news is that we do know how to make our food systems more productive, more nutritious, more sustainable, and more equitable, as highlighted in the Growing Better report that Ed referenced earlier. And these solutions are within reach. There is a bold movement within the Food System Summit process called the Coalition for Zero Hunger by 2030, which is really gaining momentum and seeking to mobilize the financial resources and political resources needed to take the actions needed to reduce hunger, to reduce it to less than 200 million hungry people by 2030. And in doing this, while meeting the Paris targets for 1.5 degrees C and generating decent livelihoods for the 500 million small-scale food producers that Rebecca was talking about. It's important to note that this is going to be science-based, based on evidence and how to reduce hunger most effectively, and really recognizes the need to do this while responding to the COVID crisis that has led to so many more hungry people on our planet. As FOLU, we're really proud to champion this effort. It's been developed and championed by our partners at GAIN, and we really see this as a globally transformative effort that we want to see advance. Next slide. And as we work on hunger, we can't forget the global race to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible for the safety of our planet. We need to grapple with the fact that food systems account for 1/3 of global greenhouse gases, but also account for a significant opportunity to sequester carbon. So as FOLU, we're supporting a food and land net zero country alliance through the Food System Summit and beyond. And this is a voluntary coalition of countries that commit to net zero emissions from food and land use sector by 2050. Members of this coalition will develop bold strategies for how to get to net zero, or even ideally net negative emissions. They'll receive technical assistance where they need it to develop those strategies and take action via policies, improved practices, and investments. And crucially, this coalition will monitor progress over time to provide mutual accountability. It will target both the production side as well as the consumption side, so incorporates many of the food loss and waste issues that Liz talked about earlier, and really covers a diverse set of land use, land systems, forests, grasslands, wetlands, rangelands, and dare I say, even aquatic systems. So we as FOLU are working to build momentum for this coalition through the Food System Summit process and really into COP26 and I said beyond, continuing then. And then my last point, because I know we want to get to questions that are coming in. Next slide. It's a very interrelated point, but I want to highlight the importance of boosting nature positive production, which has a home under Action Track 3 of the Food System Summit, which really recognizes that biodiversity and well-functioning ecosystems, as we've heard many times already today, underpin sustainable food production and our ability to eliminate hunger, malnutrition, and meet biodiversity and climate targets while staying within planetary boundaries. As we know, food production systems are the biggest driver for the decline in nature, responsible for 80% of deforestation, 70% of freshwater withdrawals. But it doesn't have to be this way. There are nature positive food production pathways that protect biodiversity, such as deforestation and conversion-free supply chains, which is something we're working hard at. There's ways to manage landscapes in a nature positive way, such as the agroecological approaches or the aquatic food system approaches that Christian talked about earlier. And last but not least, we really have to focus on restoring degraded lands and degraded ecosystems and rehabilitating the soil function for sustainable food production. There's many efforts underway across the world along these three lines. It's a priority for all of the FOLU country platforms and something we will be working very hard at in partnership with governments, civil society, academia, and the private sector to really achieve nature positive production at scale. And with that, I'll stop and say thank you.
Christina, thank you so much for that presentation. I have to say, it's gutting to hear that hunger is on the rise, and I'm conscious that that's not what we want to see. I think we are now going to move into our discussion and Q&A session. So what I would like to do maybe is just to stick with Christina, since she'll be freshest in your minds. And just thinking about that fact that hunger is on the rise and we have this coalition. I mean, is this coalition going to be able to reverse this trend? Is it a blip? Is it a, you know, is it more significant? And what is this group doing that makes you think, you know, they may be able to get it in hand?
Yeah, great question, Edwina. We don't know yet if it's a blip, if it's just due to the pandemic and the impact of the economic disruption and food production systems that we've seen that have really shown us how fragile our food systems are. We don't know yet if it's a blip, but we absolutely need to be going in the negative direction, not reversing the progress of the past few years. This coalition is looking to mobilize a huge amount of funding, 4 to 5 billion, but it is within reach. It has quite a bit of political momentum, and when you think about you know, how much we've been able to mobilize in terms of COVID recovery funds, I do think that it is within reach. I also want to highlight that this initiative is really learned from past efforts on how to reduce hunger, how to do that efficiently and effectively. And as I said, it's going to be guided by science and evidence. And I think that's a really important change, a really important measure that we need to recognize.
Great, thank you very much. And that does sound hopeful. So just keep on posting your questions into the Q&A function. We're picking them up as they turn up. I have a question here for Liz. Liz, the question is, do you see an opportunity for network producers, so farmers and fishers, to connect directly with end customers, or at least individual supermarkets, with only the shipping company in between?
I think I think that is a great question. I mean, there are all sorts of opportunities coming with improved communications and apps and technology solutions that are going to make a big difference. And one of the problems that we've got is that supply chains have got very long and complicated. And so it's very difficult to get communication and transparency up and down the supply chains. And that then on its own causes food loss and waste. So having much shorter chains are a great solution if you can make them work and you can get the right collaborations together. So I think, yes, the world's our oyster in terms of finding new ways of doing things better. And it's interesting that I think some of those very short chains were created during COVID because all of a sudden farmers lost their markets and so they had to find new ones. And we did see some of those. I've heard examples of certainly in Ecuador where that happened. So yeah, plenty of opportunity there.
Thank you, Liz. I've got a question on research into crops. Rebecca, I think that's one you wanted to pick up.
Sure, I'd be glad to. This was a comment from Paul Ngungo, and I thought it was quite an important comment. He touched on the fact that the research, it's not only more funding for research that's needed, but it's also more focus on these so-called orphan crops, which are not only often more nutritionally superior, but they are often also more resilient, so more able to withstand droughts and floods that we're seeing more and more of around the world. And to me, this is an indication of why research needs to be demand-led and focused not only on the big commercial crops, but also crops that are often produced by women, for example, that may not have a whole lot of commercial value, but are critical for food security. And to date, they have received quite a bit less investment from research, but imagine how productive they might become if we were focusing efforts on, science and technology on these types of crops as well, instead of just the major commercial ones. And I do think that will become more important as climate change continues.
Thanks, Rebecca. And just to say, if any of the other speakers would like to build on any of the answers being offered, please do add your own views. So I now have a question for Christian. Christian, the question is, would it help to bring attention to aquatic food ecosystems if some of the produced aquatic food was carbon negative?
Yeah, of course, definitely. I mean, that was part of what I was saying earlier, that I think if you're highlighting that dimension, particularly if you look at the same comparative amount of protein that would be required, to feed a hungrier population from terrestrial sources, and look at the energy input, the carbon production, the amount of water that would be used, is intensive. Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting that we would only eat bivalves and mussels as our protein around the world, but that is less intensive when it comes to land use and converting land use into agricultural or creating forests and other biodiversity rich areas into agriculture areas. Likewise, there's very little water that's involved and energy. So I think some of the research that came out of the work of the high level panel definitely indicated and pointed out that that certainly as part of the solution set of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you can get there by the ocean alone through 5 solutions to about 20% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 that are going to be required within the 1.5 degree requirement. And part of that is shifting diets to aquatic sources. This is not, however, just saying we're going to need to go out and eat lots of high the sort of species that are at the top of the top of the food pyramid. We really need to think carefully about where we are fishing, what we are eating, where it is coming from, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. And so I think there's some terrific, opportunities that are there, and we need to highlight more of that as we have some of these discussions in the coming decade.
Yeah, and I think that's where our two worlds overlap, if you like, that shifting diets point, that different foods have different climate impacts, and that we need to see is people consuming fewer of the, the high climate impact foods and more of the more efficient ones. Another question for you, actually, and maybe this person was inspired by the heat wave, because I think the heat wave in Canada and North America created some problems for sea creatures. I think that some of them were cooked alive, which sounds completely grim. But the question is anyone looking at the future livability of continental interiors, night and days becoming too hot so that farmers need to move themselves and their producing operations to the coasts?
So I think that's a fascinating question, and not just from the perspective of changing climatic conditions or degrading lands, up in sort of inland, but also the changing socioeconomic dynamics and demographic shifts and migrations that are occurring, and an obvious I guess transition that is happening is seeing a lot of migration moving to the coast, and the easiest thing for and the simplest is this, a pole and fishing line to either feed your family, protein, or generating some sort of income. But that really is not going to be sustainable over long periods of time. And so one needs to think carefully about, the impacts of regeneration, on land, and what does that mean to avoid some of those kind of catastrophic migration patterns that would then have a really big impact on the near shore resources, and thus a spiral. And I think that's what I meant earlier in my comments about, not just treating the land and ocean as separate entities, but thinking about how does the land going to affect the ocean, and how's the ocean going to affect the land, and really treating them to one and the same. But I think it's an area that I think is ripe to look at some of those systemic drivers of resource decline within the near shore and marine systems, because that is going to have a big impact on how we manage them. But are there ways at which we can avoid that by managing upstream, as it were, on land?
Thank you very much. So now I have a question for all of the panelists, and this is in relation to your expectations in terms of the concrete outcomes that will come from the Food Systems Summit. So will the main results be voluntary coalitions? And the person who poses the question says it's hard to know what to expect when there won't be a negotiated agreement. So I might start with Ed and then go from there.
I think it's a brilliant question. We don't know the answer. It's as you say, Megan, it's not a negotiated agreement. But we do think that these various coalitions will land. Many of them will be taken forward in other processes like the COP26, UNFCCC, G20, and others. I think it will generate new funding from governments and from philanthropic communities, organizations, and the like. But most of all, I hope food system is at the heart of global public discourse and thinking. There's never been a food system summit in 75 years of the UN. This is the first time that so many people have been brought together across so many different parts of the food system. So I do hope it marks some kind of turning point in global attention and action on addressing the food system.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, that actually this is the first time, so in and of itself, it's significant for that very reason. So we almost have to grasp this opportunity. Christina, may I turn to you next?
Sure. I mean, I think there will be concrete initiatives launched, if not at the pre-summit next week, at the summit in September. But I think it's really only a starting point. And as Ed said, it's really about starting to put the food system back together, and it will be the home or the starting point for a number of different initiatives that will continue beyond the lifetime of this Food System Summit, and who knows what further incarnations of the summit there may be. But I really am hopeful that there will be concrete coalitions with funding, with actions, with targets and some accountability systems developed to take things forward. It might not be, everything might not succeed, but I certainly think many ambitious initiatives will be launched at the summit.
Wonderful, thank you. Rebecca, from your point of view, what's your expectation?
Yeah, maybe I think my colleagues have covered it very well for the food summit per se, but just maybe one thing I could add is that we do expect food systems to be a major focus of the COP meetings in Glasgow that will follow. So for COP26, and that is an opportunity where countries will come together and focus on sort of the climate related aspects of food. And there is potential for, I think, some pretty significant movements there as well.
Thank you. Liz?
So I think there will be some concrete things coming out. I think one of the major benefits that I see is that it actually gets food loss and waste certainly on the agenda, because for so long it's not been on the agenda. I don't know why it's not an attractive area to fund and it's not discussed. But this is actually forcing some member states to go over the line and say, yes, we think this is important and we're not going to achieve Paris targets without doing something about it. So that in itself is already a success, but let's build on it right up to September, because we should be able to get many more countries actually sticking their heads above the parapet and saying, yes, this is important to us.
Absolutely, thank you. And Christian?
Yes, perhaps just a couple of things. One is really that in the original design of the summit, there was very little discussion around the aquatic foods agenda, and so I think, if nothing else, really firmly make sure that aquatic foods are on the agenda of the summit later this year, but not treat that as a silo and have that a thread that runs into the COP15, the Convention on Biological Diversity, that leads into COP 26, that then leads into Stockholm plus 50. These big moments where we should be making sure that 2/3 of the planet is really accurately represented, and the importance it plays in our lives. And perhaps just a couple more points on terms of those concrete outcomes. Inclusivity in terms of small scale actors. There's a real danger to have some of these discussions at a summit level, but really not thinking about what does it mean for some of the small scale actors. And certainly one of the questions there about that's come in about integrating fisheries into their efforts of those small scale actors, and thinking about just as you're talking about farmers, talk about fishers and what are those fishers and the roles that they play. And then I think we'd very much like to see that the increasing recognition of important role of aquatic food by governments, and trying to form an alliance that will then, as I mentioned, take that forward. So not specifically, I would say, concrete sort of outcomes on the ground. I think we're perhaps one step from that, because we really wanted to get that recognition at the summit level, and then see how we can develop those solutions and innovations for that action that's being required. But make sure we're touching on biodiversity, climate change, and those big moments that link into it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Christian. So I have a question from Megan, just to say, I think Ed and maybe Christina are going to respond to that. So it's a question around how many countries are planning to join the Food and Land Use Net Zero Coalition, and when will it be announced?
Thanks, Edwina. I'll respond very quickly. I mean, it's early days yet. We're looking for an ambitious number of countries to join 10 to 20, both from the global north and the global south. And we hope to announce it early in 2022, but early days yet.
Fantastic. And Ed, have you anything to add to that?
The dream would be that a good number of the world's most significant agricultural emitters would join, but we are in the early stages of dialogue with those. Over.
Thank you. So we've got 5 minutes left, and I see there are still lots of questions coming through, so you'll have to forgive me if I don't get around to every single one of them. But one of the things I was just interested in was the waterfall diagram that Ed, you presented at the start. And I was just conscious that, you know, it seems to paint a picture of this menu of changes that we need to see. So, you know, if we go business as usual, we're going to be at 50 gigatons of CO2 for the food system, and we need to get to 4. I'm just interested now that we've kind of heard about all these solutions, how you see everything linking together. You know, do you feel that this is a good way to frame the conversation given the insights we've heard?
I think that chart is a remarkable insight into what needs to happen. I think the Food Systems Summit has made us realize how interconnected this whole agenda is. Just today, we've talked about hunger, adaptation, marine fisheries, diet shifts, food loss and waste, meat production, animal welfare. I mean, all of these issues are playing themselves out. And I think that chart gives us a roadmap of what needs to happen globally. Now, in every country, of course, the roadmap looks distinct. And one of the beauties of the Food Systems Summit is that 140 countries have engaged in national dialogues and are committing themselves to a national plan and a roadmap to food systems reform within that country. And that, of course, looks distinct in every place. But I think the UN Food Systems Summit, that chart and this process has enabled us all to think about the kinds of shifts that need to happen across the system if we're to navigate this century and beyond.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. Rebecca, I'm going to just come back to you. We've got a question just around the needs of Indigenous people and small-scale farmers. So I think, you know, the summit has had some opposition, and I suppose this question is related to that. So just how to promote their interests, or, you know, how to represent them and square their needs with the perception maybe that the event is promoting agribusiness.
Yeah. So I think I would go back to some of the points that I made about the need for sort of local community, local actor involvement, so it's not all top down. And one sort of framework that might help us to think about this and think about more specific ways to engage local actors who are often Indigenous groups and, you know, community, civil society organizations, are these principles for locally led adaptation that WRI and several partners have arrived at, that talk about the need to devolve power, decision-making, finance to the local level. And I think if we focused on implementing those types of principles, that would go a long way towards addressing the concerns about that, you know, some pretty important people in the global food system are being left out of it.
Thank you very much. So this is my final question, and I've saved the best for last, Liz. You know, as someone who has worked a little bit in the corporate side of looking at food loss and waste, it's interesting that it's always been seen as a lever to end hunger, but it's now increasingly being seen as a significant way to mitigate the climate impact of the food system. And I'm just wondering, has something changed? Is there a new framing, or is there an increased understanding of the opportunity that tackling food loss and waste can do in relation to climate change?
Yes, thanks, Edwina. I mean, it's great. It is a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer. I think the drivers change over time. It is undoubtedly true that we have a much better understanding of the potential contribution that tackling food loss and waste can make to greenhouse gas emissions. But I think we also are increasingly aware of the cost of not doing something, and you know, the implications of doing nothing are becoming worse. And so I think it's a combination. I mean, when we first started looking at food waste, it was all about the environmental impact, and then it shifted to the cost, and then shifting back in. So I think it does change over time. And for different audiences, it will be different. I mean, certainly for businesses, there's going to be a primary one of, you know, there's a clear financial business case of reducing food loss and waste. But they're also seeing that there's a moral question there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. So it looks like we're at time now. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank our speakers very much and our audience for the questions and engagement. It's been a great session. Just to let you know that everyone who is registered for the event will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and some follow-up resources. But for now, please do check out our blog that builds on the points that we raised today, and it's live on the WRI website now. But thank you very much for your time today and have a great day.